Alright guys, welcome to day 5 of the 7-day video sprint. I just wanted to pick back up where we left off from my MGM hands yesterday. There were kind of a lot, so I'm probably going to end up splitting this up into 3 different videos, this one being the second. Let's just keep going. The first hand that I talk about I actually recorded yesterday, so don't mind the costume change. A weaker player open limps in early position. This is not a straddle pot, so we're back to 5. I'm in the hijack with 8-7 offsuit, and I decide to isolate to $30. Now, I'm not necessarily raising the 30 to take it down pre. I think this player is going to call reasonably often pre-flop, but by isolating him, I can create situations where I get to see bet a lot of flops, and he's going to fold too often because his range is too wide pre. I'm also in position. I'm in the hijack, so if I can get everyone else to fold, and I'm just in position the whole way. Now, it doesn't quite go according to plan. The small blind cold calls the 30 and early position limper also calls, and we go 3-way to a flop. The flop is ace-9-8 rainbow, and it checks to me. Now, my hand is almost strong enough to check for showdown value, I think. I do have some backdoor potential for straights, and I also can hit 2-pair and trips. But by the same token, I think that the person who cold called in the small blind, who's a regular and pretty tight pre, has a lot of pocket pairs and like types of hands that might fold to 1 or 2 barrels that are not ahead of us necessarily, but have a lot of equity. Something like Jack 10, King Queen, 10-9, and the original limper is just, his range is so wide that we're going to get a lot of folds, I think. So I decided to bet 65, and the small blind folded. Early position called, and we went heads up to the turn. The turn is pretty much the nut card in the deck for us. It's the 8 of diamonds, which completes the rainbow on the board. And the best part about it is that the early position player led out for $65. This is weird. This is a really weird spot to lead. I had seen him do this a couple of times, so I know that it's not like he's never doing it. But I didn't have any kind of sizing tell. Like, I didn't know whether he was sizing small for any particular reason. So I kind of have to assume he's doing it for the same reason a lot of players do it in this spot, which is to either, set your price for a draw, set your price because you have a semi-weak showdown value hand, or to try to get someone to raise. Now, I don't think this player is really trying to get me to raise by betting the same amount that I bet on the flop. I think he's just trying to see the river for cheaper. Now, because I just hit my gin card, I'm going to raise. The only question is really, well, actually, we don't really have to raise here. I think calling is an option if we think that by raising we fold out too many of his hands. But I think that he's made it so small we can raise and really just get more value from a huge portion of his range. So I think Jack 10 is a pretty big portion of his leading range here. I think maybe some 9x he would lead, and I think some weak aces as well he would lead. So I figured that in the end, raising is probably better and more effective, and so I made it, what did I make it? I made it 220, which compared to the size of the pot is actually not a really huge raise. The only problem is when a player like this bets 65 and you make it 220, or significantly larger, it looks pretty big. It looks bigger than it actually is. But he did end up calling. The river was the 9 of spades, and he now checks. This river is interesting because I think a lot of players perceive it to be a scare card, and they might check behind some stuff. But for me, it's actually a fantastic card because it looks like a scared card from his perspective, thinking about what I would bet, if that makes any sense at all. So he's going to see this card, and if I bet, he's going to say, wow, hey, wait a minute. What can he be betting here? Like, he wouldn't bet an ace, even though I probably would. He wouldn't bet, pocket kings or whatever. I wouldn't bet pocket kings, but I wouldn't be in this spot with pocket kings anyway. And he's suddenly like left with this range for me where he can't think of any value hands that I have. And, because he wouldn't value bet ace king or ace queen in this spot. Again, I would. And so really I should just go for a big value, because if he calls the turn with a showdown value hand, so it's not just like Jack 10 that bricked out, he's gonna put it together and think that I can't really have anything. And so as long as he's willing to make a big call with one pair of aces here, then I think we're gonna get called pretty often. The one thing that I regretted in this hand was not betting bigger on the river, because we had probably 500 behind to play with on the river card. And so there was probably 500 behind on the river, and I could have bet, up to that amount basically. I ended up betting $340, and he did tank for a while, so usually when someone tanks for a while, it means your sizing is probably spot on. But I also think that he just had to think about it, and he might have called a bigger bet. He did end up calling, and obviously my hand was good. He didn't show, but he seemed very surprised when I turned over my hand. I think not so much that I had it pre-flop or that I raised, the turn with it, but more so that I bet the river, because again, in his mind, the 9 is actually a bad card for me, whereas in my mind, the 9 is actually pretty good because he can't have a 9, and it just gets him to call me more often. In this next hand, there are 4 limps, and I have 3 deuce offsuit in the big blind. So rather than just mucking my cards, I decide I'll see a flop for free, and I check. The flop is 5-4-2 with 2 hearts. I decided to lead for $15 because I figured that a lot of people are limping a lot of hands that just won't connect with this board at all. I'm actually ahead a decent amount, but getting people to fold 2 overs is always good. And then on top of that, I have tons of equity if people are actually ahead of me. So I lead for 15. 3 players call. So much for people not having anything. The turn's the ace of clubs, which is a pretty decent turn card for us. And I lead for 65 now. The under the gun original limper calls. 1 player folds. And then middle position, who is also obviously a limper, makes it 200. Now this spot is a little bit awkward because of stack sizes. I have about 775 in my stack, and the first player who called the 65 under the gun, he only has about 230, 250 on this street before putting in the 65. So if I decide to do anything other than call, it's pretty much going to be a shove. And if I shove, I'm going to create potentially a pretty big side pot with middle position, who is really representing straights for the most part. Pretty hard for him to do this with 2 pair. I feel like most sets would raise the flop as well. 2 pairs also, although he could have something like ace 5, I guess. But it's a little bit of a weird hand for somebody to raise 2 pair on the turn because there's a one-liner out there. Even though most people don't have 3x in their range that much, in a limped pot, things kind of change. So I don't think I was ever realistically going to fold, but I was pretty on the fence about whether I should call or raise. In the end, I decided that middle position as well as under the gun can both have some draw type hands in their range. Some flush draws that, or maybe even ace-x flush draws that now have top pair. And so it's better to get the money in now and both not have to make a decision on the river, but also not let anybody get away on the river when they brick. So I ended up shoving, Oh, the other piece of this is that I feel like I'm chopping with one of them reasonably often and just kind of hoping that neither of them flopped a straight with 6-3. Now, if they did flop a straight with 6-3, I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that they raise the flop too, again, with it being so wet. So I think chopping is probably worst case scenario. Like if I'm chopping and then one of them has some sort of super draw. So I shove for 775 and under the gun calls. Middle position then thinks for a really long time, which is definitely good for us because it means he doesn't have us beat. I also think most players probably wouldn't think that long with any sort of straight. So if they have any 3 in their hand, they're just snap getting it in here. It doesn't really matter that I took this line. They have the second nuts, they're not folding. Eventually he calls, which at this point I think is good because, again, I think it's unlikely he even has a 3 in his hand. So feeling pretty good about this spot now. The river is the not so pretty queen of hearts, which brings in the flush. I turn over my hand. Under the gun turns over ace-4 of hearts for flop second pair, turn. So flopped second pair with the nut flush draw and a gut shot. He turns 2 pair to go along with everything else, and then he rivers the nuts on the end. Middle position ends up mucking his hand though, so I actually take down about a, what is it? It's almost $1,000 side pot because under the gun had about 225 and the bet was for 270 or for 775 total, so about 550 each in on the side. So I did actually end up making money on the hand, but it would have been pretty nice to scoop. This next hand is a little bit weird because we see what happens when no bets go in on the flop and there's significant action later on. There's a reg who is pretty tight pre-flop, who open limps in early position. A player in middle position who was very tight. He wasn't really limping at all. I'd seen him raise only a couple times in maybe a couple of hours. He makes it $30 in middle position. I'm in the small blind with ace of spades, king of clubs, and I'm maybe $1,000 deep with this player, maybe 900. I think this is a spot where a lot of players just auto 3-bet because they have ace king. But based on what hands I think this player is opening, it's not really profitable to 3-bet because he's not going to call with much worse. Not even convinced he's opening much worse than what we have. And if he 4-bets, we're basically always folding. So I'd much rather flat, even though I'm out of position, and just keep the pot a little bit smaller, let him think our range is wider than it is, and keep his range a little bit wider than if we were to 3-bet. So I flat the 30, and both of the limpers call as well. The flop is 10-5-2, 2 spades and a diamond. Now this is kind of cool because I have the ace of spades, which means, you know, I can do some interesting stuff if I want to like take a bluff line, or if I peel and pick up a flush draw, that can be good too. Just for helping me navigate later in the hand. It actually ends up checking to the pre-flop raiser, and he thinks for a while and checks. So I think a lot of the times we're going to have a very similar hand. He's either going to have ace king, ace queen, ace jack, or like king queen suited, something like that. So it does check around. The turn is the king of spades, which is pretty interesting because it's very good for our exact hand. However, it looks like a better card for the pre-flop raiser's range than for anybody else. And because of that, I feel like nobody really ever bluffs in this spot, and I didn't really want to lead with this hand and just be ridiculously face up against some players who are actually hand reading. I decided to check, and oddly enough, the first limper, so the open limper from early position, actually leads for $85, and it folds to me. Now, all of the reasons I just talked about for me checking because it looks strong when I bet also apply to the limper. I would have expected him to check most hands to the pre-flop raiser. So I'm already actually kind of wary. The first things that are crossing my mind are things like 2-pair or sets that went for a check raise on the flop but couldn't couldn't get there. But by the same token, there's stuff like king, queen, and king, jack that he might just take a little bit of a weird line with because there's 3 spade cards on the board. And I'm like very, very close to the top of my range in this spot. I don't think I'm checking sets that often on this turn card. I don't think I'm really checking 2 pairs. So if I have ace king, I think I probably have to at least call one and see what happens on the turn, or excuse me, on the river. Particularly since I also have the nut flush draw now. The river is the 7 of diamonds, which bricks my flush draw, and I check. The early position player bets 275. This is a weird spot because of the sizing, I feel. His turn sizing, I think, is pretty normal. It's like 85 into 125, or 120-ish. And so now he's betting 275 into, what, like 290-ish? So that's pretty concerning. I mean, there's definitely players who are capable of bluffing in this spot, and some of them definitely are at this table, but I haven't really seen this player get out of line in a spot like this. I haven't seen him really bluff at all post-flop, so it's hard to know whether this sizing can really be a bluff or not. But I'm kind of left with the same problem that I had on the turn, which is I am very, very close to the top of my range, if not at the top. And if I'm not going to call with ace king all the time, I should probably be calling with this specific combination because I have the ace of spades in my hand, and that means that there are no nut flush combos in his range. He can't have like ace 3 of spades that just stumbles into the nut flush draw on the turn. He can obviously have some other flush combos, but I think that since we block a lot of his flush combos, we should just call here. People do some weird stuff in live poker. He can definitely bluff sometimes, and although we're not getting a great price, I think it's probably still going to have to be a call with this exact hand. If I had ace king offsuit, I would be more inclined to fold for sure. That being said, it's just not a fun spot to be in, and I definitely had that kind of sinking feeling in my gut as I put the call in. And he gives us the bad news, turns over queen 9 of spades, and we lose that one. People were kind of, I wouldn't say giving me flack, but I guess more sympathizing with, the hand that I had in that spot, but basically saying like, you can't really fold that exact hand. Now, if I'd had some sort of physical read on him or some other kind of information beyond just, oh, he's irregular and I'm not sure if he's capable of bluffing in this spot or not, I could definitely lean much more strongly towards folding or more strongly towards calling, depending on, what that information was. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. I will see you tomorrow in the next one.